fundamentally, history is driven by people. And because people are messy, that makes history messy. Iran Contra is probably the messiest event I've ever tackled. There are so many conflicting interests from so many conflicting parties who all have so many conflicting intentions. A lot of those intentions, which were actually kind of good. In fact, it's so complicated that I can't do it in one video, which is why I'm going to do it in two on the same day. That's right, you guys are getting a double upload. So lucky. Good job. The way I thought about Iran Contra is essentially, it's a bunch of bombs being set up and then eventually all of those bombs blowing up in succession in a chain reaction. So that's how I'm going to present it to you. In this video, when this symbol shows up, that's considered a bomb being set up, essentially. You consider it a foreshadow. Keep it in your head, because it's going to be very, very, very important later. You're not going to know all the information just yet. But when the bombs do blow up, and you do eventually figure out everything, trust me, it's going to be worth it. And with that, let's get started. So our story starts in the 1980s, and this time period was the end of a decades-long multinational conflict known as the Cold War. Now, the Cold War is massive. In fact, if I did videos on it on this channel, it would probably be a 20-part series. By extension, that makes it really hard to explain. So I decided to get someone else to do it for me.
The Cold War was a conflict between the US and the Soviet Union. It's called the Cold War, but for a lot of countries fighting in it, it was, in fact, a hot war.
The major powers both had nukes, meaning they couldn't really fight each other directly. So they proceeded to do what we call in the business a pro-gamer move. They got someone else to do the fighting for them.
These proxy wars, as they were called by the Soviet Union and America, involved heavy funding from both sides.
And these things happened everywhere, including here, and like I said, it was a global conflict. However, our story specifically takes place in this proxy war occurring right in the middle of Central America in a lovely little country called Nicaragua. Nicaragua is a small Central American country that was going through a lot of political turmoil during this time period.
In a 1979 revolt, a left-wing liberation front known as the Sandinistas overthrew a corrupt government. However, they were very, very left-wing and also started out mass execution and oppression of the indigenous peoples in Nicaragua. And they really started a corrupt military junta, and over a period of time, although they technically were all their fighters came from out of inequality and out of a poor community, they became corrupt
and ended up becoming generally disliked by the local population. Now, let's turn our attention back to the US for a minute. Now, the second prerequisite that I kind of have to explain is the president during this time period, and in fact, most of the 1980s. And his name is Ronald Reagan. Now, you may have heard of Ronald Reagan because in the US at least, he is incredibly controversial. Now, if I did a video series on Ronald Reagan, it would probably be 20 parts. But what you have to understand for the sake of this video is that Ronald Reagan is someone who hates communism. Out of all the Cold War presidents, he was probably the one who believed the most that the US was ideologically superior in almost every single way to the communist-loving Soviets, and that it was his duty as the US president to eliminate the evil that was Soviet communism, no matter the cost. When Reagan saw a bunch of people getting mad with the current communist Sandinista regime, for reasons I couldn't possibly tell you, he of course sent every Latin American dictator's least favorite organization, the CIA. And through a little bit of training and a lot of weapon sales, the CIA was able to transform these disparate groups into an effective guerrilla fighting machine, known as the Contras, because they contradicted the Sandistas. No, I'm serious, that's actually exactly why they were named. Now, believe it or not, Congress hated communism too. So they were actually pretty okay with all of this, and they even funded the Contras. However, things started to change in 1985. Why? Well, it turns out if you want to overthrow a government, you need a lot of money. A lot more money than the US can provide. So the Contras were essentially faced with the difficult dilemma that has plagued terrorist groups, even to this day. How do you obtain a stable source of income besides outside funding? Well, the long answer is that you have to engage in illegal activities to raise money for your cause, because no one can stop you if it's illegal. Now, the short answer, and the answer that I personally prefer, is that you deal drugs. That's exactly what the Contras started doing. Specifically, they sold drugs to the United States, which was a really bad look at the time because the US government was currently undergoing a massive anti-drug program. Ironically led by Ronald Reagan, but that's a story for another time. This, alongside the numerous war crimes the Contras were committing, thanks CIA, officially soured public and congressional support for the Contras. So when Congress decided to pass their budget in 1985, They made absolutely sure that the CIA could provide $0 of funding towards the Contra cause. This was called the Boland Agreement, and frankly, it pissed Reagan off. This directly went against the wishes of Ronald Reagan and his administration. Now, don't get me wrong, Ronald Reagan hated drugs, but as established earlier, he hated communism more. This willingness to do anything to defeat the communist threat would lead to Reagan setting up one of the largest bombs in American presidential history. It involves one of America's deadliest enemies, a little-known country called Iran.
Prior to 1979, Iran had been an American puppet state, but after the revolution was a rival nation that America was not allowed to trade with at all. However, they had much influence over the paramilitary group in Lebanon that had 7 American hostages.
Okay, so what I'm about to do next is explain some really complex geopolitics in a very simple and quick way. So if the next couple parts sound confusing, that's because they are. Okay, so the Lebanese militant group that Shrin was referring to is called Hezbollah. Yes, that Hezbollah. And they're homies with Iran. Now, the US obviously wants those 8 hostages back, so they're going to try and make a deal with Hezbollah through Iran, because, Hezbollah is a terrorist group, so you can't really make deals with terrorists. However, the US and Iran, and by extension Hezbollah, all hate each other, so they're going to have to figure out another way to make this work. Luckily, Iran is at war with Iraq, which is of great interest to another power, Israel, because Iran and Iraq are both enemies with Israel, and Israel wants to keep those two fighting so it doesn't have to deal with them. The US is going to send weapons to Iran, who they'll give to Hezbollah and will use in the Iran-Iraq war. In exchange, Iran will tell Hezbollah to let the hostages go, and they'll give the US a lot of cash as well. All of this, by the way, is going to happen through Israel, because Israel is the only country that's probably willing to facilitate this deal. Well, would you look at that? The Reagan administration now has a bunch of money which they did not get from Congress, aka money they can use to fund the Contras. The bombs have all been set, and now we just wait for them to explode in the next video.